I'm going to go into more detail about flash on learning how to light this week, with particular reference to what to look for when choosing one. If you're thinking of buying a flash or even investing in a whole system, I'd pay quite close attention because I've got some very, very important pointers for you that will hopefully prevent you from spending a small fortune on something that doesn't do what you want it to do. So for the next few weeks on learning how to light, I'm going to take you through the different types of lighting you'll encounter. So flash, continuous light and natural light, and try and give you some advice on how best to use them. I'm going to start this week with flash, talk you through how it works, what it does, along with some of its pros and cons. Okay, time to talk about different types of lighting. Now I'm going to start with flash, because flash is by far the most complex. Everybody's pretty familiar with flash. You're very used to seeing them built into cameras like this, or things like these flash guns, and you might even have one in your smartphone nowadays. But flash is an incredibly versatile and useful lighting tool. I use it all the time. It's probably my main form of lighting, in fact, so it's well worth knowing an awful lot about it. It can be a little tricky to learn by the very nature of it being a flash, a very brief pulse, and the fact that things like this look quite complicated and technical, but don't be afraid. They all follow a fairly basic set of principles, no matter whether it's something like this, or even little ones built into your camera. What I'm going to do is talk briefly about how flashes work in the first place, which is actually very, very simple. Then take you through the obvious pros and cons of using them. Then I'm going to give you a little bit of insight into what to look for when you're buying one, and also going to go into a little bit of depth about how you trigger them, because that can get quite complex. But for now, don't be afraid. Don't worry, I'm going to take you through it nice and slowly, even though flash can be very, very confusing. Trust me, it can become a very, very useful friend. All flash units, whether little battery-powered standalone things like this, or big mains-powered ones like this, function in essentially the same way. They draw power in, either from their batteries or from the mains, and they store that power in a big capacitor. Then, when they're requested to fire, that capacitor then pushes energy out into the flash tube, or flash tubes in some cases, depending on how big they are, and that creates a very, very brief pulse of light, which is your flash. Of course, the amount the capacitor gets used up depends on how powerful your flash was, and of course you can adjust that. You can have a full power flash, and in decent flashes, as we'll come on to later, you can adjust the amount of flash they put out each time. So you might find the capacitor barely gets touched as you fire off a very low power flash, but if you fire it at full power, the capacitor will almost totally drain, then it'll have to draw more power from the mains before it's ready to fire again. That's essentially it. Now obviously the specifics of how this works, how that works, how the built-in one in there works, how that works, I can't go into in a course like this. As always with things like that, my suggestion would be go and read your manual properly. Go and look at the specs online to find exactly how your flash works. Now something like this is known by me at least as a flash gun. Something like this, and this is known as a flash head, although more accurately a monoblock because they're a single self-contained thing. Versions of these sort of things also exist in what's called packs and heads, whereby you have a large power pack which contains the mains or battery input and then the capacitors and the control panels, and the head is a separate unit which is then detached via a cable and is generally much smaller and lighter. Those are packs and heads, flash heads or monoblocks, flash guns. If you're outside the UK, you might know these as strobe. Now I don't call them strobe because this is a strobe. Okay, something that pulses flashes very, very, very quickly. A flash is a flash. I've always called them flashes, and I've been doing this 20-something years. I've only heard them called strobes, or occasionally in the case of flash gun, speed lights in recent years, but they're flashes. That's what they do, let's be honest. But just so you know, in case you're confused thinking, when's he going to talk about strobes? Okay, again, this is a strobe. Right, a little of light like that. They flash, so we're going to call them flashes. So now we know what they're called, and the very basics of how they work, let's go and look at the very obvious pros and cons. So starting with the pros, well, the biggest reason, the main reason you see photographers using flash is that you get a lot of power in a small package. This flash gun, for example, which I think you'd agree is pretty portable, and it runs off just AA batteries, which of course are available anywhere. In the right circumstances, this has got enough power in it to balance and sometimes even overpower the light from the midday sun. Okay, that's a lot of power in a small package. Something like this mains powered unit is in the region of 5 to 6 times more powerful. But if you look at the relative size, it's still, it's not that much bigger. And this isn't something enormous to cart around. It's not the same size as a light you'd see on a film set, for example. This is actually pretty portable, and you get an awful lot of punch out of it. The reason it's more powerful as a small package is, of course, because of that capacitor and the brief pulse of light. It lets light out in a very short pulse rather than steadily over a continuous period of time. That means that brief pulse is much more intense, than the same thing coming from a continuous light source. The fact that they are powerful in small packages is probably the main reason that photographers like me use them all the time. The other big plus is, think back to those 4 characteristics of light. Think of the last one, colour. They're broadly the same colour as daylight is. Think back to the Kelvin scale, 5,000, 5,500 Kelvin. Flashes are pretty much around that point. That, of course, is very handy if you're trying to make sure you don't get funny colour casts in things, because we tend to shoot in daylight most of the time, so these are going to match pretty easily. What's also good is flash pretty much stays cool. It's not quite the case. If I were to have this at, say, full power and keep firing off flash after flash after flash after flash, this would start to get quite hot to the touch, but that's only because this doesn't have cooling fans in it. By comparison, something like this or something like this, which has cooling units in it, can fire full power flashes all day long. That's handy because it means I can attach things to it and they're not going to melt or be set fire to. It also means I can have them quite close to my subjects, and although obviously the light will be bright, the heat should be bearable. By the same token, if I took tungsten lights, incandescent lights of any sort, and put a very powerful light next to somebody, you can imagine they'd get quite uncomfortable quite soon. Since flash is such a standard thing amongst photographers, there also exists an almost infinite array of modifiers you can add to your flash in whatever form. These, of course, will allow you to make the light softer or harder, depending on what you want, and there is almost everything out there, from the cheapest, nastiest things going to hugely expensive things costing thousands of pounds, things that make your light incredibly soft, things that make your light incredibly hard, things that are incredibly robustly, brilliantly built, down to cheapo little improvisation ways you can do it yourself. All of them are designed to work with flash. So you've got that advantage. You can literally just buy something off the shelf, plug it straight in, and your light will become softer, harder, whatever you might choose. And lastly, on the positive side, flash is also very, very useful for high speed and action photography, because that short duration of the flash, that pulse of light, helps you to freeze movement, even beyond what a fast shutter speed can do. So what are the downsides? Well, all the drawbacks of using flash are related to the fact that it's a flash. It's a very short pulse of light. First off, that can make it very hard to assess what the light is doing. Think, if you will, of using something like a torch, as I did in some of those earlier examples, and you can aim a torch at something and you can see what's light, where the shadow's falling, how the light transitions from highlight to shadow. With a very brief pulse of light, that's quite hard to do. It can be very hard to work out, how the light is shaping how you want, and also if you're using several lights, how their powers are in relation to each other. You might want a soft front light and then a harder back light, but you want the powers to be at the right sort of level in terms of this needs to be correctly exposed and this backlight needs to be about a stop brighter. Well, just by looking at the flashes, you're going to really struggle. You'll have to check the back of the camera, maybe use an external meter, or use some sort of automatic metering system. So the brief pulse of flash makes it very hard to assess what the light is doing. Now, one of the ways around this is you can use something called a modelling light. Big mains powered lights like this have them. If I just turn this on, and without looking, try and remember where the switch is. The modelling light, there we go, is effectively a continuous light source, in this case a tungsten bulb, that is in the same housing as the flash tube. So you don't use it as the main light, you use the flash tube as the light, the brief pulse of flash, but that modelling light allows you to get a feel for where the light is falling, and you can set it proportionally related to the flash power, so you can get a feel for how different flashes are in relation to each other. Flash guns like this sometimes have a modelling function whereby they fire off a pulse of light to give you a feel for things, but it's not that effective. Battery ones like this also have a modelling light, but obviously a continuous light wears battery down very, very quickly. So if you want to get a feel for what the lights are doing, you've either got to use a modelling light, which generally you only find in larger flashes, or you've got to keep checking the back of the camera all the time, which can get a bit tiresome. Another problem, quite a big problem, is that this very brief pulse of light has to be synchronized with the camera shutter in some way. Otherwise, that very brief moment when the camera shutter is open to expose the sensor and the flash going off, they won't see each other. So that flash will be wasted because it won't happen to be at the same moment as the shutter is open and the sensor is exposed. Synchronizing these two things can get quite complex, which is why later on I'm going to go into much more detail about triggering flashes. In a very obvious case, if your flash is built in like this, well, triggering is not a problem because, of course, all the circuitry is all connected. If this flash was on this camera and I took a picture, the flash would fire. By the same token, if I were to attach this flash gun via what's called a hot shoe on the top of the camera, well, obviously there's clear communication there. It should be able to be triggered without any problem. The catch comes when you want to have your lights in all sorts of different locations and you want to have more than one light. You want to have lots of different flashes on the go. Then you've got an issue with triggering because they can't all be hardwired into the camera. And of course you might not want them wired into the camera because there might be issues of distance, there may be cables to trip over, all sorts of problems. That's why, like I say, later on I'm going to go into more detail about triggering because it can be so complicated. Now, this might be obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway. Flashes, by their very nature, are not much use for lighting video. Unless you're deliberately trying to create a special effect, the brief pulse of flash is no use at all for video lighting. So if you see yourself doing a mix of video and stills, or primarily video even, then you're going to want some form of continuous light source because flash is, I'm afraid, pretty useless to you. And the last drawback to using flashes is that they can take a while to recycle. Think back to how they work. The capacitor stores loads of power and it discharges that power through the flash tube to make a flash. And as I said, if you fire off a full power flash, that entire capacitor will be almost completely drained. It'll only leave a tiny bit in there to sort of start itself up again, and it won't be able to fire again until it's filled up. Now, either it draws that power from the mains or it draws that power from a battery, but it's still going to fill the capacitor back up again. And depending on which flash you're using, that can be several seconds. A flash gun like this, for example, on normal batteries, if I fire a full power manual flash off, the time to full recharge is somewhere in the region of 7 seconds. I'm going to have a quick go at it now. I'm going to set this for manual, and I'm going to turn the power to full power. I'm going to fire a full power flash, not at the camera, because that wouldn't be fair. Here I go, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 seconds. There's also brings me to my other point about this, which is that there's usually a way of them telling you they're ready. In this case, a little red light comes on. This is attached to the camera. There'll be a little visible sign in the viewfinder. These will have lights on. Lights like these will also have audible beeps sometimes saying they're ready to go. Now, obviously, that was 9 seconds. This has probably got quite old batteries in it, if I'm honest with you. And it's only a little battery-powered flash. A mains unit like this will be ready to fire again, even at full power, within a couple of seconds. And of course, in all the cases, across all flashes, as you turn the power down, the recycling time decreases as well. So you may find by the time you're done at quarter power or even eighth power, you can fire bang, 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 as quick as you like. So if that's a concern for you for shooting something that's very fast moving, you don't have lots of time to wait between shots, you might want to consider not using flash, or you might want to engineer a system whereby you're using your flashes at much lower powers. Okay, so a really basic primer on flash there. Next week, I'm going to go into more detail about flash, particularly with reference to how to choose one if you're thinking of spending some money. Okay, I might have whetted your appetite for some gear acquisition there, but hopefully I've also given you some really important points to think about before you spend your hard-earned cash. See you next week when I'm going to talk more about how we trigger flash.